Good afternoon. Today's Battle Rhythm, Creating Meaningful Change for Military and Veteran Families of Color, will be hosted by Jeanette Gillis. Jeanette is the director of the Network for America's Warrior Partnership. The network provides veteran serving organizations with connections to national resources when a veteran's request cannot be met locally. To find out more, please visit americaswarriorpartnership.org/the-network. Jeanette, that's all. I'm going to pass the floor over to you.
Thank you, Allison. And I would like to welcome everybody to our August Battle Rhythm. Can you believe it is August already? I know I cannot. I'd like to welcome all of our affiliate communities, 4-Star Alliance members, veteran service officers, and any other guests that are with us today. Thank you for joining us. Today, we have some subject matter experts from Blue Star Families, and they have a wonderful presentation for us. And I am going to allow them to introduce themselves and let you know what their role is at Blue Star Families. I'd like to start with CT. CT, can you introduce yourself and tell us what you do at Blue Star Families?
Thank you so much, Jeanette. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlandra Moss, and I go by CT. I am an Army retired first sergeant, just retiring last year. And my proudest role now has been a military mom. So I have my daughter serving in the Air Force, and my son is in the Army. I am coming to you from Tampa, Florida, and currently I'm the director for our Racial Equity and Inclusion Initiative here at Blue Star Families. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Hi, thank you so much for having us today. My name is Jennifer or Jenny Akin. I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Social Impact Research here at Blue Star Families. And with my partners at the Dinello Institute for Veterans and Military Families at Syracuse, I was the co-principal investigator on the research that we will be discussing today. I am technically still an Army spouse, although my husband's on terminal leave, so we will very soon be a veteran family. And we recently relocated from Fort Bragg to Charlottesville, Virginia. So we're coming off of a move there. She's not listed on this slide, but I'd also like to take a second to allow Ashley Scott to introduce herself. She's recently joined our research team and will be helping out some today as well.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for having us. As Jenny said, my name is Ashley Scott. I'm the Policy and Innovation Coordinator with Blue Star Families, and I'm here to support Jenny and CT with the slides and in the breakout room. So I'm excited to be here today. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you three for joining us. I'm excited for your presentation and to learn more about this topic. So I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone, and we're excited to share with you our social impact research for 2021, where we had the opportunity to speak with military families and veteran families of color. Just a little bit first about our mission here at Blue Star Families. We use this model, our Listen, Share, Partner, Act model. One of the great things about us and the feedback that we receive is that so many individuals are excited that we are listening, that we're able to create a platform for others to be able to come on and share their stories and to be able to translate their stories into our data to be able to impact change. And so we're elated to have partners on board to be able to help us support military families of color, military families in general. And then just to be able to act out and delivering those programs and being able to identify the challenges. I want us to take a moment just to look at this quick video.
My son was going to school at Stanford, but he drove down to this place where we stay at this base. And the first time he went through, they gave him a hard time. And that weekend was kind of a disaster for us. We didn't have a good time because he was really upset at how he was treated. So we created a new policy in the Bostic household that once he was about 100 yards away from the gate, my wife she'd get in the driver's seat and she would drive him in, and we'd have a great weekend. And now it was a 3-star. And he was driving up to the gate. He called He goes, no, Dad, it's going to be all right. I'll just drive it. So he drives in, and 5 minutes later, he says, Dad, I need help. I'm at the gate. And I run to the gate, and there are 3 policemen with their weapons drawn, pointing at him in the car. And one of them's holding up my 3-star placard. And I walk up and I say, what's the problem? And he says, well, this young man has got this placard of a 3-star. There's no way this is his car. And I grabbed the placard and I said, that's my placard. I worked about 30 years to earn that. That's my son, and that's my car. So I want you to put your weapons down, relax, and I want you to tell me who your boss is. I had the rank to make change. If it was my dad, Master Sergeant Bostic, and this happened to him, he'd just say, okay, I've been stepped on again, but he'd move out. But he wouldn't be able to challenge the system.
We had nowhere to turn. And my husband was very high up tempo at that time. He was deploying so much. And I was alone in a lot of those situations dealing with it. My son had a knife pulled on him. He had slurs called out to him. And at that time, we didn't have school liaisons. This was in the 90s. I didn't know anybody that I could reach out to. I didn't even know how to report this incident other than to the school. And nothing was really done.
I was stationed in a small town in Mississippi, and he was racially profiled twice. He was 13. He was tall for his age, but if you had a conversation with him, you clearly knew he was 13. But because of that, my family, we had to make a tough decision, and I no longer felt that my son was safe. I made the decision that he would go move with family, all because I was afraid for his life. He started and finished high school without being in my home, and that was tough.
George was in the Army for 41 years. I never knew until being on this committee that there were people of color who turned down assignments because they feared for the safety of their families. I never knew that. 41 years, for God's sakes, and I never heard that.
Overnight, across the country, the calls for justice are growing more intense.
But it keeps happening. No matter what's done, no matter how many protests, it keeps happening. It's always been happening, but now it's just recorded. That's why it's getting seen more.
It just feels to me that this is the right moment where a lot of organizations are doing really important soul searching. That process is not going to be fast, and it really just requires all of us to start having more in-depth conversations.
This is a time to strike.
Over a year ago, Blue Star Families took on the challenge of creating a more inclusive community through our Racial Equity and Inclusion Initiative, with our board vice chair, Lieutenant General retired Gwen Bingham, leading the charge.
My fellow committee members and I have a goal of addressing 5 impact areas: research and advocacy, training, leadership, collaboration, and community impact.
This is why this group is important. During the survey, a lot of information from the families, they talked about the lack of understanding about Latino culture and the types of families that come all together and want to be heard, and want to be seen, and want to be given the opportunity. And often we forget about that.
That data surprised me. Without that data, we can't address, why people don't want to go to the South. Without that data, we can't address why the unemployment for spouses of color is higher than the regular unemployment.
We want to be the role model, to bring everybody together, to create networks and show the world how this can be done.
We need to keep making progress. We know that being more diverse and more inclusive makes us stronger. We have the opportunity to be examples, to show the world what's possible and what can be achieved by being stronger together.
Thank you. Before we move straight into the data, I always tell Jenny, as many times that we've done this brief, and I've seen this video to this, and it had have been several dozen times. But I still get choked up about this video. We have to move this video to the end of the presentation, Jenny. I keep telling keep telling you that. But this is why this is so important and why we do this work and why it's important to us. A fact, a data point that Jenny and I talk about a lot, and ever since she mentioned it to me, it forever lives in my heart. And it's that in 5 years, so by 2027, the most recruitable person will be a person of color. As Jenny put in the chat, take this opportunity to drop one word in the chat about how you feel about our video. But as we move forward with the presentation, as you can see here on the slide, 3 in 10 service member identifies a racial ethnic minority. This is why this work is so important. We also found out that 1 in 4 families are either bi or multicultural families. And so it's just not, so we've learned that DOD or the military, they only track the service members' ethnicity, but they're unaware of the families of the service member. And that's just another reason why this data is so important. So what is our mission here at Blue Star Families and our racial equity work? We just want everyone to feel welcome in the communities in which they serve. As you know, you don't always have the privilege to choose where you live while you're serving. But despite that, we want everyone to feel welcome. And that's going to affect our mission. It's going to, one, strengthen our mission, our total force. And we understand that diversity absolutely will strengthen our total force. And so this is why we do this work. You'll often see throughout our presentation today, our campaign for inclusion. And I wanted to take just a moment to kind of explain that. When we started this work in 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, and here at Blue Star Families, we decided to do a poll just to check on military families of color, to ask the question, how are you doing? And do you feel a sense of belonging in the community? And the real results, as I'm sure you are aware, were not shocking. And we found out there's resources that military families of color oftentimes don't know about and why. And we found out that the reason why is oftentimes we don't know about MSOs and VSOs and those programs. Representation matters, and there's just a lack of diversity in those spaces. And so our call for action was our racial equity work. And in our first 2 years, we truly have taken this show on the road, and it's become our campaign for inclusion. With that, we have 5 special impact areas. We call them our pillars. As you kind of saw in the video, our leadership, and I'll kind of go through that just a little bit. Jenny will cover our research and advocacy. I'll highlight a little bit on our training, our call for action that I'm super excited and honored to oversee, our fellowship program, and all of it really just a culmination of our collaboration and community impact. So with that, here is our co-chairs for our Racial Equity and Inclusion Committee, having myself as the director, but I have 3 bosses. I actually have 4 bosses to include the CEO. But this committee, I say that I have over 30 bosses. Our committee is a representation of general officers, military spouses. We've opened it up to funders, Purple Heart recipients, senior enlisted, and I'm just excited to have them on board. A priority of mine when I came to Blue Star Families last year was to ensure that our committee looks like our total force. And so we still have some work to do in ensuring that we have a representation for everyone, but I'm excited that this is our committee. They provide thought leadership. They help me with strategic communication. They validate our work in this space as they continue to help Jenny and I with resources and who should we be in contact with in the community, whether it's stakeholders and the government officials, or even just senior leaders in the military. Here is what I'm most excited about right now. This takes up probably about maybe 60% of my time at Blue Star Families. But one of our call for actions, as I mentioned to you about military service organizations and veteran service organizations, are just underrepresented of people of military families of color. And so our call for action was to start this essentially a pipeline of leaders that will go on into our MSO and VSO spaces. And that is our Deploy Fellowship Program. Deploy is an acronym. It stands for Diversify and Expand the Pipeline of Leaders of Your Military Communities. I know that's a mouthful, but I've been saying it now for about a year and a half, so I think I finally got it down point packed. But this is our second cohort. We had an inaugural class last year. They all have graduated as of June 30th and moved on to into MSO and VSO spaces. And so I'm excited to have our second cohort who began July 11th. They all are military spouses, just so happens, and just so happen to be women. That wasn't by design, but we have them embedded within our chapters and also programs and have different focus areas. So we're excited that they will graduate next summer and they will go on. And this is how we're continuing that work and to be able to increase the diversity within our military and veteran service organizations. And now I want to turn it over to who I call my battle buddy in this space, Jenny Akin.
Thanks, CT. I always love watching CT get so excited talking about the fellows. They're like her kiddos. So watch that cohort. They'll go on to do great things, and they will be on the job market in just a few short months at this point. So as we mentioned at the top, we really are looking at doing a comprehensive effort, and everything at Blue Star Family starts with data. So you may be aware of our military family lifestyle survey. We also do other needs assessments and that sort of thing. So when we started doing this work, the first thing we did was look at our data. And unfortunately, what we found was that, and this is not being hyperbolic, there was virtually nothing in the literature about military or veteran families of color. Lots about service members of color, lots about veterans of color, but nothing about spouses and children. So we set out to rectify that problem. We encourage you to check out the report, which can be found on our website. And I do have a link, QR code you can scan here in a moment to find it. But we started by looking at what was already done. We explored more in our own research, did new analysis of existing data sets. The report itself is organized by the social determinants of health. So kind of regardless of what field you work in, you'll probably find something there to speak to your work. We did also start with some focus groups. We had a great team of about 13 researchers that all held different pieces of the research product and puzzle, including some subject matter experts for focus groups. We did offer them in Spanish, and we did offer the survey in Spanish as well. And generally, we did try to recruit families of color themselves. So when I talk about our findings, I'll give some limitations here on that in a second, but note that we really were trying to recruit and speak to the experiences of those families, to include some multiracial families as well. We then went out into the community after we had our initial results, but before they had been published, and we actually briefed over 100 people within government, within the Department of Defense, at the community level, other nonprofits, all to help inform our recommendations. So I'll give very high-level overview of the recommendations today, but we do have some really great tangible and actionable recommendations in the report, as well as some case studies of people we believe are organizations that are doing it well. And as CT mentioned, now we're on step five. We're on this campaign for inclusion. So with that, I'll get into the data. I'll leave this up just for a second in case you'd like to flip through the report. Your phone can get that QR code. As with most of our survey data, this survey is not generalized, but we can only really speak to the respondents of the survey itself. We don't do any weighting. And a big reason for that, particularly on this survey, is, as CT alluded to, the department itself doesn't even have a good understanding of how many dependents there are of color to begin with. More on that in the methodology section if you need it. Just to save time today, when I say respondent, I do mean somebody who's self-identified for the most part with at least one racial or ethnic identity other than white. So we've got 6 big takeaways from this survey. We are a very strengths-based team, and one of the first things that we found in the literature and that we validated in our own research was that military service really does have quite a few benefits for service members and veterans of color, particularly if you ask them to compare themselves to their civilian friends and family of a similar racial or ethnic background. Not perfect, not universal by any stretch of the imagination, but very positive perceptions of their professional careers, some financial stability compared to civilian counterparts, much higher levels of education, and healthcare as well. But this slide is really where we started getting into discovering that this was going to be a bigger report than we originally anticipated. In our focus groups, it became very clear extremely quickly from the first focus group that military families of color are really sitting around the dinner table at night, and they are making really big decisions about their military life based on perceptions of race and racism in local communities. And that, we believed at the time, was just a fundamentally different approach to military life decision-making than some of our white non-Hispanic families. And so we asked about those in the survey, and we did see that, yes, military families of color are taking certain things related to race and racism in communities into consideration for decisions. They're considering it when leaving service. They're considering it when ranking their installation preferences. And when we started to ask, are there certain areas that you don't feel comfortable going to, or you do? We did see that more than twice as many active duty family respondents of color did report not at all being comfortable being stationed in the Midwest, Alaska, or the South compared to other regions in the United States. We always caveat that, because when you take residential data among veterans who can, by and large, choose where they reside, that data actually reflects and it mirrors that of the broader US population. So you see Black veterans residing overwhelmingly on the East Coast, Hispanic and Asian veterans predominantly in the West and the West Coast. And so you can't simply say X group doesn't want to live in X location, because it's a little bit foggier than that, and probably comes down to county by county or even installation by installation level. And I will say, as I'm talking, we recognize that many of these stats and stories may bring to mind certain emotions or experiences. And we just want this to be a space where we can talk about those things. So feel free to drop questions in the chat as we're going along, or to share if this is validating or surprising at any point. So the next thing that we did was really look at, okay, so you've considered these things in your conversations. Did you actually make any of these decisions? And we did see that nearly 1 in 3 of our families had turned down orders. And when we asked why, you saw things you would expect, like stabilizing family, low quality of life in the area, but you did also see racism in the local community was the number 3 reason among that population. So then we went on even further, because we probe here at Blue Star Families. Did you, in fact, experience negative consequences? And yes, nearly 2 in 3 of our active duty service members said that they did, with it being a career-ending decision for about 15% of those. So then we're looking at community climate. So we have looked at considerations, things you would make ahead of decision making. We're looking at decisions you've already made. What happens if you land in a community? What's your experience there? And we asked a series of questions. We fielded this survey in summer 2021. So we asked a series of experiential questions about the previous 18 months, so up to January 2020. What you're looking at here on the left-hand side in the blue bars are the percentage of our respondents, active duty family respondents, who reported fearing for their safety due to their race or ethnicity at least once. You're looking at it by region. And the orange bar is the same thing with regard to being threatened or harassed. What that slide is telling you is that you're seeing very high levels of these incidents in almost all regions. And they don't perfectly align to where people said they were not at all comfortable being stationed. They're somewhat close, but not perfect. On the right-hand side, we did also ask a lot about police profiling. This came up a lot in our conversations and focus groups. What you can see are the vertical bars. You see that we had similar rates of perceived or of police profiling by both military and civilian law enforcement for each of the 3 racial and ethnic groups we were able to analyze. However, trust was much higher, and that's the green bar, in military law enforcement compared to civilian law enforcement. And while on its face, that's a great story, it's still not great that you only have 49% of your Black active duty family respondents who say that they trust their military law enforcement. And that's even more striking when you take into consideration that most of those respondents are spouses. So I think there's a lot of work to do on those issues as well. So we also looked at finances, and I did allude to the fact that finances is one area where it gets a little murky in looking at the good story and also the hard reality. What this slide is telling you, and this is data from the Urban Institute, is that Black and Hispanic military active duty households, by and large, are doing better than their Black and Hispanic civilian households. So the military service does kind of help provide a little boost there, but they're still lagging their white and Asian military peers. And that sort of trend is one that we saw across a number of issues throughout the survey. I don't think it's in this deck, but this is even more striking because much of this is driven by two things. One is that Black and Hispanic households are overrepresented in the enlisted corps and underrepresented in the officer corps. So pay scales are different. But the other piece of it is we did some original analysis of census data. And what we saw when we looked at that census data was that you take a hit to your household earnings for being a military spouse. We all know that. You take another hit for being a female in most cases, which most military spouses are. But then you take another hit to your income if you are Black or Hispanic. And that really culminates for the Hispanic or Latina community, where they are earning over $20,000 or $22,000 less than the US median earning, 66% less than the US median. And so we suspect there's probably a language component as well. And as a result of that, by the way, Blue Star Families stood up a bilingual career placement program that's taken off because of the demand. So if you're interested, I can get you more information on that as well. So this slide is what most needs assessments would comprise of. So ours, again, was a little bit more comprehensive than that. But this slide really tells you a few different things. One is that we saw a greater variety of unmet needs among our veteran family respondents compared to our active duty family respondents. So they need more things and much higher levels of unmet need. However, the barriers to utilizing resources were actually pretty much the same for both communities. Overwhelmingly, it's uncertainty about eligibility and lack of knowledge about how to access resources. So that we've seen that, by the way, in every single research study we've done. We've seen lower levels of knowledge about resources in our communities of color or respondents of color, which is what CT alluded to earlier. And we know that many of these families are going to nonprofits, are going to VSOs and MSOs to try to learn more and connect in the broader community. But again, that lack of representation sort of hinders that to be effective. And so we're taking that on. And if you are an MSO or VSO, please take that on for yourself as well. And I'm glad we have a session today on how to engage with diverse communities, because I think there's some lessons we can all learn there. And finally, military culture really does play a role here. We hypothesized that it would, and it did. So that series of questions that we asked about the previous 18 months or so, we asked how many times, right? So the previous slides were looking at least once. This slide's looking at instances of discriminatory behavior in your military community, not your civilian community, your military community, at least 5 times in that period. And you can see that it's worse among the active duty service member population. And then it gets a little bit better for the veteran community and a little bit better for the spouse community, but it is still present there. And this really is summed up. There was a focus group participant who said, sometimes we're just having camaraderie, team building activities, and somebody will say something. And, it's kind of off color, but it just keeps going and keeps going. And the sounds of silence are deafening for my colleagues. And really just that inability to have somebody stand up and say, it's not really appropriate in this environment. So again, the recommendations. So this is about 30 pages in our report. So these are going to be very high level. But our top recommendation is that we need to collectively do a lot more work to build stronger relationships and more inclusive military and veteran communities. And that is in the broadest sense. The number one recommendation of our respondents was actually to provide more opportunities for dialogue like this. They really liked the Department of Defense town halls. They liked having open forums where they could have these hard discussions and be validated by them. Also wanted some allyship. So I alluded to that a second ago with the quote from the focus group. But the number one requested allyship action was somebody like myself, who is a white non-Hispanic individual, or anybody really can do, is to be an ally. So if you see something, say something. Really, that's what they're looking for, is somebody who will speak up against racism and racist comments if they are happening. We also had a pretty strong desire for more and better mentorship. And so we worked with our Racial Equity and Inclusion Committee to put together a new framework for mentorship that would be more inclusive of some of these more nuanced understandings and help people navigate their careers more effectively. And importantly, extend that framework and that mentorship opportunity to spouses as well as the service member themselves. This is, I think, probably why many of you are here today, is that we think there needs to be a little bit more communication and engagement across civil military lines, especially at the local level and especially around military communities. Really allocating the resources to be able to do that, making sure that there is representation and talent that you're using from the community itself. And collaborating locally. An example of a specific recommendation we give for the department is to really surge DEI assets to those installations where there may be a less diverse community around the installation. So those are going to be the places where you may not have as many health or mental health providers who are representative of the military population there, or teachers, or really anybody. Those are the places where your school liaison officers really need to know DEI. They need to have DEI training and know how to handle situations if they arise. We also have some recommendations to strengthen and diversify the all-volunteer force, and I'm happy to report that 2 of these are moving forward. So our first was to update DEI plans to include military family members. Almost all of the offices we briefed, and we did brief every DEI office from every branch, said that this had been a blind spot for them. They hadn't really considered military families when they were doing their DEI plans. So we are hoping that those plans will be updated. We believe that they will be, because for the first time ever, military families of color were included in DoD's Equity Action Plan. So there is like a line item in there that says advance equity for military families. Yeah, that's great. Also applying some best practices from other industries outlined in our report, assessing existing entry paths to help make sure we are diversifying our force. And we really want to look at diversifying, especially the officer corps. The enlisted corps is actually fairly representative, in fact, more representative than the population writ large, but there's some blockers to the officer corps that we think more can be done there. One of them was that there is no data on ROTC scholarship award. So you can see completion, you can see who commissions through ROTC by race and ethnicity. But we were just able to successfully get into the House version of the NDAA, and hopefully it'll get through the Senate as well. The ability to track ROTC scholarship award and program completion by race and ethnicity and gender. So hopefully we'll get to learn a little bit more about that, because of course ROTC scholarships are tremendously beneficial. And finally, because we are data nerds, we have some data collection improvements we recommend. First is that we actually utilized a combined race ethnicity question that the census recommends, because we are changing as a society. We may have multiple racial and ethnic identities and need the ability to equally identify or separate that out, not simply say I am biracial or bi-ethnic or whatever. And so we do use that. DoD is not allowed to use that framework. So that's an example. If you're looking at your own data, how you collect data in your organization, really we have a link to the census recommendation itself in our report. You can pull that. Also making sure that all federal records, we're hoping, will add a military identifier or a military family identifier, I should say, so that we can track things like SNAP utilization, for military families, not just a service member or children within the school system, is now added to most educational records, but not necessarily all, and adding race and ethnicity to the DEERS record so that DoD itself can get a hold of that. So some recommendations there. We did also work with a handful of other nonprofits and also some of our funders to develop some best practices. So CT led, and I'll have the full logos here in a second, but CT led a subcommittee of the White Oak Collaborative. The White Oak Collaborative is a pretty big collaborative of nonprofit, governmental, and some philanthropic organizations that all come together to advance the needs of military and veteran families. So I think there were about 23, might be missing that number, but about 20 to 25 organizations who helped create best practices for the broader MSO VSO space. Thank you very much, CT21. And there's a QR code. If your organization is interested in seeing what this group here on the left came up with, that's where you can learn more. We are in the process of building a roadmap. It hasn't been launched yet. That you could sign up and get emails every quarter and help just over the course of a year get your organization closer to where you'd like to be, aligned to those best practices. And we are extremely grateful to these organizations for helping us out with that, because we don't know it all. We just want to help elevate these things. And we also met with all of our funders and a few other external private organizations because we knew that there were things from outside of our space that we should be adapting. One of the things that came through really clearly that we hadn't really considered was supplier diversity as well. And so I think that's just an example of things that we don't typically think of in our space, but there are best practices for. And again, a lot of really good examples of what all of these things look like in the report itself. And we couldn't have done this without our funders. Again, no research had been done in this field. Now there's a foundation to build from. We are going to be releasing another report, a much smaller report in February that is really focused on community attributes. So what is it about what communities that help bolster belonging or undermine it? And how many experiences did you have in certain communities? But importantly, we're going to tie actual experiences of racial discrimination towards yourself or your child to your willingness to recommend that community and to recommend military service. So stay tuned for that. So more to come on that field or on that front. So thank you very much. And it wouldn't be Blue Star Families if we weren't asking you to do a survey. If you have time, we would love to get feedback about the presentation, areas you'd like us to explore. Really anything would be helpful. And if you're interested in helping us in any way, here's how you can do that or have any questions answered. Although for right now, you should put questions in the chat and we'll do the best that we can to answer them.
All right. So far, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if you have any questions, we have a minute or two to answer a few of those. So please jot those in so we can get those addressed. And while we're waiting on that, I would like to thank you both. This was a very powerful and thought-provoking presentation. Brought up some things I hadn't thought about or hadn't realized. I'm really kind of saddened to think that this is going on and in our society in general, but especially in our military community. And thank you for your personal story, CT, as the mother of a high school junior. I feel that. All right, it doesn't look like we have questions, so I'm going to turn this over to Allison, and Allison is going to get us ready and guide us to our breakout activity. When you're picking your topic, you have two to choose from. The first topic is combating unconscious biases, and the second topic is strategies for engaging diverse populations. So Allison, guide us to the next activity, please.
Thank you so much. And I echo what Jeanette said. Very powerful presentation, you guys. Thank you for sharing. Lots to think about, actually. I think it's why we don't have as many questions. Everybody is sitting there just sort of amazed. Maybe not amazed. Maybe some people are like, yeah. And other people are like, wow. Anyway, so we have our, if you will, please add your organization to the end of your name so we can spend more time talking and less time introducing ourselves to each other when we get into groups. It's very helpful. So for the next 25 minutes, we're going to go into breakout groups. You can select the groups when I open the rooms. So the first one is, like Jeanette said, combating unconscious bias. That's going to be led by CT and Ashley. And then topic 2, strategies for engaging diverse population. So please, you know, it's supposed to be a conversation. I promised Jenny and CT that Ashley that they didn't have to carry the whole entire presentation, and it's supposed to be a conversation. So let's get everybody talking and discussing. I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms now. See ya in 25 minutes, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. I'm sure it sounded like you guys were having great conversations, and we've already had some really good feedback about how good the conversations were. So how about group number 1? So that was combating unconscious bias. What do we have a presenter from that group?
I guess it's going to be myself, Allison.
Didn't volunteer anybody, huh?
We were still so wrapped up in our great conversation. We didn't get there. And I knew we were going to run out of time on this topic. But, you know, we just went through the definitions of the difference between unconscious biases and microaggressions. And Ashley, you can put, if you want to put those 2 definitions in the chat, then I won't have to go through them again. But we talked about really, truly, like, what are some common types of unconscious biases? What was great about my group is not most, but maybe over half of our group members was married to their spouse was of a different race. And so they was really, truly able to resonate and join the conversation of being a Black woman married to a white man, being a white woman married to a Latina man, and just the challenges and pretty much what Jenny talked about in the survey, not wanting to go to certain duty stations or just really being able to kind of try to work through some things. And we gave some different, I would say, more lighthearted outside of race unconscious biases, with a few of us being veterans. Women, we talked about how oftentimes someone will walk up and say, tell your husband, thank you for your service. And that leads a conversation of, why, what makes you think it's my husband that served, you know, and just working through that. I believe it was Abby, she talked about, she gave the best example that I think, Abby, thank you, I will always remember this, is her being a white woman, and her husband being a white man, and then him being from a small town, and some of the unconscious biases that he had, for instance, that Hispanic men, you know, Hispanic people work harder, you know, and just being able to say, well, you work just as hard, so maybe it's not about race. And being able to help him, being from a very small, predominantly white town, help him through calling him out, as she would say, these are her words. And it just comes to, what do we do now? Deep, and I think we have to go through a deprogramming, you know, really, and a lot of things is learned. We had one who talked about 40 years ago, being a white woman telling her dad she's going to marry a Black man. And as you can imagine how that worked out, and we really were just kind of trying to figure out, how did this all start and where the biases come from? And we equated a lot to socialization, really just how you were brought up. So maybe even your culture in the community that you live, but how it's going to take allyship, it's going to take calling out, it's going to take deprogramming. And so if anyone from my group, if I missed something, you can come off mute and add to the conversation. But that's it, Allison. Great conversation.
Man, it sounded like you have a great conversation. Yeah, I mean, being in the South, I see unconscious bias all the time. So, yeah, calling out, definitely. And I had told, I was talking to Crystal, who had to get off and then come back in, about, like, we had to make a choice when we moved back from California to South Carolina to not be around certain people, you know. You can call it out, but sometimes you have to make the choice too, right? So, yeah. Okay, so the next conversation we had was engaging diverse population, and that was group number 2.
Yeah, I wanted to continue the conversation, so I didn't want to volunteer somebody to do this on the fly. So We had a phenomenal group. And so I think there were a few themes kind of that surfaced. The first, and several folks mentioned this, but I believe Thomas was the first. I'm sorry if I got that wrong, but the internal change really must come first. And so really recognizing, not just for ourselves with the unconscious bias piece, but also our organizations were all developed with certain exclusions kind of embedded in them, right? And so Jenny gave the great example of like, but most of their members were women, like female spouses, and they just started really pulling in male spouses in the LGBTQ community, and that can kind of extend out to race and ethnicity as well. So as we're kind of unfolding this, how do we get better? It's not just like individual but internal work, but also this organizational internal work that we all have to do and change so that everybody can feel a sense of belonging at their organization, and members coming in to the people that we serve. I latched onto this. I'm like not going to hit every point, but there were a couple of just gems of quotes in here that like bringing everyone to the table is a cliche that for some people of color, the table is the barrier. Like it implies this idea that the agenda is preset. And so like just get rid of the table, pull people together and then build the table and the agenda together. I just thought that was a really, well, everything everybody said was beautiful, but these are the things I bolded while I was taking notes. I also started off the conversation with kind of a conversation killer, which was indicative in and of itself. And that was that I asked what organizations are doing engagement and outreach to diverse populations well, and it was like crickets. And I think that's probably indicative in and of itself. Although Ben & Jerry's was provided as an example, which I thought was great. Just really clear, inclusive language. And then really looking at what are the misconceptions people have about engaging diverse communities and how do we overcome them to communicate more effectively. And really it got down to, this is a really hard and uncomfortable conversation for everybody involved most of the time. And that's how we need to move forward through it. So just trying and showing up to the conversation, being authentic and truly open with who you are, where you're coming from, and trying to listen and learn, but also recognizing that tokenism is also a problem. And so it doesn't always need to be like people of color advocating for people of color. Like I am a white non-Hispanic woman, and if I need to take the soapbox and get on my soapbox, I will. But if I need to hand the mic over, I need to pull somebody up there with me and hand the mic over. And those are kind of just together in these spaces, how we can move forward. There's a lot more to it. I hope I did my group service, but they were awesome.
It sounded like it was an awesome conversation as well. Gabby is shaking her head there. Actually, Gabby, it's funny. I see you smiling face. I kept thinking about, we're going to be talking toward the end of the year about social clubs, like veteran social clubs. How do you get in? Gabby she's been going around the country and she's made some pretty interesting observations that they tend to be segregated in a lot of places. And like, so why is that? And how do we, it's kind of like, I kept thinking about that, Gabby, today and as we've contemplated moving. So anyway, it's a big topic and it's one we need to continue talking about. And thank you, Blue Star Families, for doing that today for us and allowing us to have these conversations that we've been able to have. I know you didn't hear that last part because my microphone didn't probably pick it up, but thank you for being here today, Blue Star Families. I am going to share my screen and turn this back over to Jeanette, who is going to close us out for today. Jeanette.
I want to, first of all, extend a thank you to Jennifer and CT for the wonderful conversation, for leading that conversation, increasing our awareness of these things. And maybe this is something that we can take with us and continue to have these important conversations with our family, friends, and colleagues, and make some societal changes that need to be made. So thank you for that. I'd also like to thank you all for collaborating and sharing your views and experiences. We thank you for that as well. This is kind of how we This is how it's done. It's just talking and sharing and hopefully changing some biases that we have. America's Warrior Partnership believes that communities are best equipped to provide quality of life for veterans. We hope that today we've provided you with some insights and some best practices. Maybe you met some new partners on this call today and have some tools so that you can make some changes in your community. Our next battle rhythm will be on September 12th, and it will be focused on upstream to suicide prevention. We hope you can attend that. I thank you for your attendance today and hope you have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.